All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 7 out of 9. Um, so we are meeting, I guess, halfway through the summer now. I understand that your proposals were the deadline for the proposals was moved by a couple of months to the end of August. So I can imagine that's a relief for many of you. I can also imagine that some of you were already close to being done, so you're probably ready to start thinking about the next steps. And this is a little bit what today's webinar is going to be about. So in short, today's webinar starts at the point where we have designed our hypotheses. And so we have the hypotheses, and then essentially this webinar is all about figuring out how to do analysis, and in particular, the analyses that we will need in order to test those hypotheses, to validate them or invalidate them. So that's really the focus. And the reason it's broken up into two phases is because in phase, before actually doing the analyses themselves, which is phase 5, collecting the data and analyzing, what you do in phase 4 is you actually plan those analyses. So in other words, you design those analyses. You kind of figure out how you're going to conduct the analysis before doing it. So that's a little bit the idea. So agenda for today, this same structure as always. I'm going to do a quick recap of phases 1 through 3. That brings us to where we are today. And then we're going to go into each of those phases. So let me start with the recap. So again, we start at the end, right, which is that we want our stakeholders, our audience, to genuinely believe that we worked on an important problem or the right problem if they actually gave us the problem, that they understand our solution. That means we communicated well, that they agree with it, which means we did the right kind of thinking and analysis about it and came up with the right conclusions about it, and that they know how to implement it, which means we've actually done great work that they can actually use. And then, well, hopefully they also plan to implement it. But that is not completely within our control. So I've been sort of guiding you through a methodology to try to achieve this endpoint. Basically, the way that professional problem solvers approach most problems. And so this methodology, 7 steps, but a couple things about it, right? So we want to apply it methodically. So in particular, like step by step, every step builds on the previous ones. It's fine to go back to a previous step and redo it, but what you don't want to do is kind of skip a step. Proactively involve your stakeholders in every phase, because they have a lot of knowledge about the problem, even if they don't know how to solve it. And they can guide you, and they can help you not go in the wrong directions. And then, yeah, overinvest in a good project design. So now you have project design, meaning the problem or the project definition, figuring out what it is that you want to deliver, and then building a roadmap for that. So in the language of the methodology phases 1 and 2, you now have a couple of extra months to work on that. So definitely you have everything on your side to be able to deliver great proposals by the end of August. Okay, so what do these 3 phases amount to? So actually, a couple slides capture it all. At the core, in phase 1, the problem definition is a question about what to do. So how can help desk restore profits within 2 years? That's the example we've been working with. Phase 2 is about breaking it down into a roadmap for how to tackle the problem. So it's an intellectual breakdown, a content breakdown of the problem into what we've been calling a question tree. And the benefit of the question tree essentially is that, like, it gives us all these boxes on the right. So in this case, 5. We've broken up the problem into 5 smaller pieces, and now we just, of course, it's more things to work on, but each one is much more manageable. And then actually phase 3 that we saw last time is all about making your life a lot easier on the basis of pragmatism. So the idea is that if there's any of these components of the question tree that aren't really going to yield a whole lot of impact, or it's too difficult for the company to make an impact about that, then it's best to deprioritize it, because basically the idea is, yeah, there's not so much realistic opportunity to make a difference there. So you deprioritize it. And then for the bits that you do prioritize, the idea is then to develop hypotheses. So hypotheses are educated guesses, so not random guesses, but educated guesses that are based on some knowledge that you already have, common sense, like common, business sense and so on. So they're educated guesses about what answers or parts of the answers to these little questions could be. And so the idea is actually that you're going to spend the bulk of the project testing those hypotheses rather than trying to figure out all the possible answers to these questions and then figuring out which ones are the best. By doing this, you end up focusing your efforts on only some of the potential answers, but the ones that have a better chance of actually being the answers, because again, they're the result of an of a process of educated thinking. So it really is that saves you a lot of time and a lot of effort. And the two keys to prioritizing and hypothesizing is basically to use to invoke the notion of impact and feasibility. So when you're prioritizing, think again, which areas are we likely to have meaningful impact that is actually also feasible for the company to somehow do something about it. And then we want to make these assessments based on information that we already have, or information that is relatively easy to obtain. What we want to avoid at this stage is in-depth research, because the in-depth research will come later. The whole idea now is to find some very shortcut ways of eliminating the avenues that are basically likely to be unproductive. And then when we come up with hypotheses, again, you can come up with them either by doing an analytical breakdown of the question or brainstorming. But in the end, the hypotheses that sort of survive should be, again, filtered using impact and feasibility, and then using information that is readily available to you. And so once again, leave the in-depth research and analysis to the future phases, because otherwise it would be kind of counterproductive to spend a lot of time now in order to save a lot of time down the road. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. So now that we have hypotheses, right? So for example, in the help desk case, it's all these green statements that are not crossed out. We now know we have basically these hypotheses are directional answers. They're not specific answers, but they're directional answers, directional ways of answering those questions on the left. So basically they're directional solutions, right? So for example, to reduce the call center costs, one way to do that directionally, right, would be to shorten the calls. Find some way to make the call shorter, because then we need to spend less time on the phone, which means we pay people less and we reduce costs. But it's just a hypothesis at this point, meaning we don't know. We suspect that we can reduce those calls, the duration of those calls. So we suspect that. We have good reasons to think that, but we're not sure. And we are also not sure how we would do that yet. So this is why we don't have a specific solution. The whole point now of the future of this next phase is to figure out how would we determine this? How would we prove whether this hypothesis actually has legs and whether something can be done about it? So yeah, so phase 4 is really is in a sense, it's if we kind of follow the metaphor of the building the house, right? It's kind of like now when you're bringing all the equipment and all the materials to the construction site before constructing, before starting the actual construction. It's just kind of getting yourselves ready for that. So what we want to do, we want to figure out how do we test those hypotheses, which is essentially figuring out what are the analyses that we need to perform. And the reason that we need to do analyses, right, is because we want to be fact-based. We want to be evidence-based. It's not something that we want to just invent. It's not going to be simply our opinion. So I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to show you like a technique for how to design analyses. And I'm going to share this with you through, again, an example that comes from the world of help desk. So remember first how help desk works. The call center tries to solve incoming client problems or calls, right? And if they can't solve that problem, then they pass it on to the dispatch unit, who then sends people, technicians, to the client side to try to solve the problem there. So if we go back to our question tree, then we have a bunch of hypotheses, and in particular, this one, reducing the number of dispatches. So hypothesis is that one way to reduce the dispatch costs is to reduce the number of dispatches. So the less dispatches we do, the less dispatch costs we'll have. That obviously makes sense. But the question is, so how do we test that? How do we test whether reducing the number of dispatches is something that is feasible in a meaningful enough amount such that it actually reduces costs in a meaningful way? So there's kind of like basically kind of 3 steps to follow. First is elaborate, which means we want to be even more explicit about what we mean with a hypothesis, because the way that it was written before was extremely compact. So we want to really fully articulate it. So we want to write it in detail, in detail, the full meaning of the hypothesis, okay? Because we're going to then, what we're going to do afterwards is, if necessary, we're going to disaggregate it into smaller bits. And then if necessary, we're going to disaggregate it again into smaller bits until we get to levels of granularity that are actually easier to prove or disprove. And then the last step will be to think about how could we visualize the proof of this. So let me just kind of walk you through the example. So if the overall hypothesis was how to reduce the volume of dispatches, or reducing the volume of dispatches, what we really mean is that we believe that we can reduce the volume of dispatches to a significant extent, and this could reduce costs significantly. That's really what we mean. Okay, so now you can see there's different parts, components in this sentence. So if I disaggregate it, I get basically 2 main components. We can reduce the volume of dispatches to a significant extent, and this could reduce costs significantly. And I can actually disaggregate even more to make it even more granular. So the A bit, if we think, how could we prove that we can reduce the volume of dispatches to a significant extent? One way to, like, imagine, right? What would have to be true? And if you think about it, I mean, there's many ways we could think about it, but one way that we could think about it is that hey, what if the worst performers can improve significantly? Then yeah, so basically that the worst performers can improve significantly, and that there are ways for us to help the worst performers improve, right? If both of these are true, so in other words, the worst performers have the potential to improve significantly, and we find the ways that they could do this, then the worst performers will improve significantly, and that is, we can reasonably infer from this that overall we are going to improve the volume of dispatches to a significant, or reduce the volume of dispatches to a significant extent. All right, and then the B bit is here. I'm just rewriting the same, but it's rewriting the statement in more words, but I'm not really disaggregating it. So what we want to do now is we want to figure out how do we prove A1 and A2 and B1. And we're going to use the power of visualization to do this. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So if we take statement A1, so the first thing that you want to do is kind of draw a slide. You can do this in PowerPoint or Miro or any kind of like platform. Draw a slide, and then you just write this statement, this component of the hypothesis, right? So the bottom quartile performers can improve significantly. And that's what we want to demonstrate. So if now we want to think about how would we visualize this? And so what we could do is we could segment the technicians by their performance into quartiles, since we're talking about quartiles, right? That is the kind of visualization we could do. So we could imagine on the x-axis basically the fourth quartile, the third, second, top quartile, right? And then let's say we're going to look at their performance over some time in the past, let's say 3 months. So we're going to look at their performance, which is basically their dispatch rate, right? So that's what we're going to look at. And then I'm just going to visually, I don't know what the numbers are because I'm just imagining at this point. We haven't collected the data yet, but we could imagine it'll look something like this. I mean, it will have to look something like this. We don't know how sloped it will be, but it'll look something like this, where the fourth quartile has the highest dispatch rate, and because they're the worst performers, and the top quartile has the lowest dispatch rate. And the gap between the best and the lowest, that's the room for improvement. So now remember what we're saying that the bottom quartile performers can improve significantly. So really our hypothesis here is that this room for improvement is big. So now all we need to do is we just need to go collect the data to see if that room for improvement really is big. And if it is, we've pretty much demonstrated that they can improve significantly. We don't know how yet, but that there is that potential. So we just need to think about the data that we get, right? But we already kind of know, basically, we just need the total calls. We know we want their dispatch rate. So if that doesn't exist in that form, then we just need to get the raw data. So the number of calls that they've solved and that they've not solved per technician in the last 3 months. That's it. We pop that into Excel, we do the calculations, and then we can come up with the bars. And then, so that's statement A1, right? Now, if you remember, statement A2 was, sorry, that is statement A1. And so then we can say, all right, so if assuming that we were able to make those improvements, we can already calculate the potential value of this in terms of money, right? And so this is also some kind of a slide that you can anticipate upfront. And basically, if you imagine that like you improve the performance of the bottom quartile technicians to the level of the third quartile, it'll give you this much extra value. If you improve it to the level of the second quartile, it'll give you this much extra value, and top quartile this much. So again, we don't know what the numbers are, but you can visualize all this, and by visualizing it, you can then figure out what data do you really need. Okay. So that's the idea behind visualizing, or how you can leverage the power of visualization to figure out really how to prove something. So, and in particular, how to prove a hypothesis. So you start with a hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis, again, might be, although it might be easy to understand, it might, from a content perspective, there might be a lot packed into it. So what we want to do is we want to disaggregate it, so that we test the different components of the hypothesis. But before disaggregating it, we need to write it, fully write it out, which is the step one, elaborate. So elaborate, fully write it out, disaggregate it, disaggregate again, if helpful, and then basically think about what would it look like to make it, to show a visual proof of the statement. And from that, you can infer the data that you need. That's the idea. Here's just another example from a completely different sort of setting. But imagine that if you wanted to show that, like, or if your hypothesis was that ABC sells fewer products than competitors, you could, for example, just take, products, each product within the product category range, so A, B, and C, and then show the sales of ABC compared to each competitor. Right? And if the hypothesis is true, it would look something like this. So once you know how to visualize it, it's very easy to figure out now what is the data that we need. I'll give you another example, which is more qualitative, much more qualitative. Imagine that we have low sales about let's say some kind of a service, right? Or like a product, like a non-tangible product, let's say. Actually, it could even be tangible. And let's say that a hypothesis is that the main reason that the sales are low is because customers are not aware about the product. So now you might have come up with this thinking about the 4 Ps, right? The 4 Ps of marketing. Product, price, promotion, and place. So this basically would be a problem of promotion. So if you take the 4 sales drivers, the 4 Ps of marketing, and then you kind of say, all right, so are the products aware? Are the customers aware about our products? That's the awareness bit. Does the product fit the client needs, etc.? So each of the 4 Ps, you kind of frame it in the form of a question here. And the hypothesis, again, is that the issue is awareness. So if you were to assess a rating, you would basically give a low rating on the awareness bit and a good rating on the rest. That is consistent with the hypothesis at the top. So now, how would we actually come up with the evidence for this, that the customers are aware or not, that it fits their needs or not, that it's priced appropriately or not, that the products are easy to obtain and purchase or not? Probably the best is by asking customers. So conducting customer interviews. So there we go. You're going to get the evidence is going to be the insights that come from interviews. So we've just kind of visualized how we could prove our point or demonstrate our point. And the consequence of going through that process is that we now know exactly what we need to do, which is we need to go conduct interviews. Okay. a couple of thoughts about how to visualize slides. Some techniques for how to visualize slides when you start from or how to visualize basically a message. That's the idea. How to visualize a message, right? Like a statement. So it depends if you're. The idea is the same regardless of whether the statement is quantitative or conceptual. But it's just in the execution, it's a tiny bit different. So if your statement is numerical, so quantitative, basically you're trying to make a point about a number. Then a good way to think about it is first kind of like, so know the message, so know what you're trying to prove, know the statement or the hypothesis that you want to test. And then basically what you want to do is you want to find the kind of comparison that is implicit in the message you're trying to prove. So for example, if you say, let's go back to what we were discussing earlier. The bottom quartile can improve significantly. So, which is basically a way of saying like the bottom quartile performs much less well than the others. Yeah. So that's a comparison. And there's basically 5 different types of comparisons that occur very frequently in business. You have what's called a component, which is a portion of something. So usually like market share. You have what's called relative comparison, which is, this is smaller or bigger than. So that's the example, right? The bottom quartile is far worse than the others. It's a relative comparison. Can be a time series. I think you all know what it is, a frequency distribution or a correlation. And then depending on what kind of comparison it is, basically there are different types of diagrams that best fit. So that is how you can sort of shortcut your way through, right? So you start with a statement, kind of figure it out, and then for us, remember the example was so the bottom quartile performers can perform significantly worse than the others. So that's a relative comparison. So for that, you can use bars or columns, and we used columns. I used columns in the example because that is what intuitively people will understand the best. If your message, so the thing that you're trying to prove is conceptual, it does not involve numbers, then what you want to do is broadly the same, but you're no longer looking for a comparison. You want to know the message again, but what you want to look for now is the structure within the message. Inside the message, inside any kind of statement that is non-trivial, there's some kind of a structure. The most common structures are like cause and effect or something chronological, or something, or it could even be like a comparison is also a common thing. So you could say like this is better than something else, right? It's not quantitative, but it's qualitatively. So anyway, there's a structure. And then basically you just think about how to visualize that structure. And I'll just show you some examples. But you can visualize, for example, a cause and effect like this. So, ABC lead to our decision. That's clearly a cause and effect. And so basically you put the causes on the left, some kind of arrow in between that implies cause and effect, and then you have the effect on the right. Yeah, so it's visualized in a way that really fits the message. Or 4 major aspects determine the future of the company. I think that's self-explanatory. I don't need to explain why it looks like this. Or the new product provides 4 major benefits. Once again, the project will help to realize A, B, and C. Here, you can see all these other examples. And I think you can see, I mean, it's self-evident how the visual structure maps or fits the structure within the message. So that, by thinking like that, it makes it a lot easier to visualize something, a statement. And then if you manage to visualize it in a way that's intuitive, then it becomes easier to figure out what data do you need to fill in this slide. And therefore you will figure out what is the analysis that you need to do. Right. Speaking of analyses, so there are you can put analyses in different sort of categories. There's different categories of analyses, and I just want to point out what they are, and then make a couple of comments about them. So the most common types of analyses, or let's say the ones that use the most that are most based on logical reasoning, is what's called, they're basically causal logic analyses. So that just follows pure logic. But then there's also another way of thinking, which is actually a lot more around associative thinking, where the logic is more a comparative logic. So this is more like reasoning by analogy and association. So the causal logic is reasoning by cause and effect, and comparative logic is reasoning by analogy and association. So, for example, if you wanted to prove that, reducing the workforce will decrease morale, you could sort of make kind of a causal logic argument, which is you reduce the workforce, which means that like people are the people who are still there become nervous about their own situation. Plus, they start to think that the company cares more about itself than the employees. And so then, basically the morale decreases, right? So it's you're kind of setting up a chain of events. That would be a causal logic type of argumentation. Or you could try to demonstrate this by way of example. You could say, look, it happened at this company. They decreased, they reduced the workforce, and boom, morale decreased. So that's an argument by way of analogy. So anyway, and then of course, analyses can be numerical or they can be conceptual. And so then within each bucket, you have different kinds of things. So I think that the nice thing about comparative analyses is that when they're really well done, they really resonate. So it's kind of like you go beyond simply people following an argument, but it speaks to them. They're kind of like it speaks to their experience and their instinct rather than simply their logical brain. So that's a really nice thing, but it has to be executed really well. Causal logic is much more straightforward. Of course, it has to be executed well also, but it requires, I think there's less risk if you use the causal logic. So anyway, when you're thinking about the analyses that you want to do, sometimes you can have different options to try to prove a statement or a hypothesis. And I would encourage you again to think in terms of impact and feasibility for yourself. Meaning, if I have a couple of options about analyses, which one do I think will be the most impactful, but also which analysis is easier to do, right? You want to be managing your own return on time invested, basically. All right, then of course, sources of data. There's all sorts of different sources of data. ChatGPT or AI is not an acceptable source. I think the way to use ChatGPT or AI as a source is basically, so it will know a lot of things. So you can ask it, but then you need to ask it what its sources are in order to tie it back to real sources. But you can't say that ChatGPT said so. That won't work. So you can get data anyway. That's all about published data, right? So stuff that you can read. But then you can also get data from people who give it to you, as in they write for you or they speak to you. And there, of course, that can be all sorts of different people. Could be potential customers or end users, suppliers, competitors, third-party experts. That's one of the things that I like a lot, the third-party experts. They're kind of people who know a lot about a certain topic, because they have kind of like a little bit this helicopter view, a lot of experience in a certain area, and their voice kind of, because of their role, maybe they're kind of like in an industry association, or they work in a couple of different companies, etc. But because of their perspective, their voice counts for a lot. Anyway, so you can have different sources of people from whom you want some kind of insight, their opinions or their views. And then you just need to decide how you're going to engage with them. Is there going to be interviews, workshops, focus groups, or whatever, right? Surveys, here I really want to give a big warning to everybody. You need to be extremely careful with surveys. Basically, surveys, I think, make sense when you are, let me first give the risk. So the risk with a survey is that like you end up putting a huge, that you end up putting in a huge effort and that you get very little back. That's the risk. And this risk basically is very, very pronounced with the wrong kind of survey. So basically, you can conduct a survey to do two kinds of things, either just to get objective facts or to get subjective insights. So if you want to get like objective facts, then there's a question about do you want to quantify that, or do you simply just want to extract them from people's minds? So for example, if you just want to understand the, I don't know, the when do people brush their teeth? You know, do they do it like first of all, how many times per day? Do they do it once, twice, three times? Do they do it before breakfast, after breakfast, before going to bed? So if you just want to understand that, but without necessarily quantifying it, then you can just interview people. And this is just an objective fact, right? There's nothing subjective about this. You can also conduct interviews about more subjective things, like if you want to know what they enjoy and dislike about brushing their teeth, right? So, or again, I guess the examples on the page here, if we're, instead of brushing their teeth is, you know, the subject, the objective facts could be how frequently people buy a certain product, how frequently they buy, I don't know, toothbrushes or whatever it is, right? You can just ask them and it'll give you a sense. You can also ask them why they buy a certain product, and it'll give you a sense of the most important reasons that drive people to do that. If you want to quantify the objective facts, you can run a survey. That's fine. That's actually pretty efficient to do that. And indeed, if you really want to quantify and kind of say, hey, you know, 30% of people do this, whatever, buy a toothbrush at least X amount of times per year, and 40% at least X amount of time per year, et cetera, you're going to need a survey, and you're probably going to need, you know, a statistically relevant, a significant number of respondents, 28, 27, something like that. But the bit that is very dangerous is to try to quantify subjective insights through surveys. And the problem there is that basically you need to be qualified to run those kinds of surveys, because whenever you're asking people about subjective things, you need, like, the whole art of asking the right questions is so important, and that is something you need to be professionally trained for. So I would say avoid surveys that focus on quantify, where the objective is to quantify subjective insights. I would even kind of say, if you want to quantify subjective insights, your only option is to rely on surveys that have been done by others. But if you simply want to understand the most common reasons why somebody does something, like buy a product, then conduct interviews. And the great thing is that, with 5 or 6 interviews, just 5 or 6, all the important reasons will come up. It's almost unimaginable that a significant reason why somebody, let's say, buys a product, that such a reason would not come up in 5 or 6 interviews. It's almost inconceivable. So all the important stuff will come up. So that's a little bit my big warning about surveys. You want to be clever about this just for yourselves. Right, so that kind of concludes the bit around designing your analyses, kind of thinking about the design of your analyses. So how do you know you're done here? Well, basically, for each of your analyses, each of your hypotheses, you've designed clear analyses, so you know exactly what you want to do. You know exactly why each analysis matters. So in other words, you can, without having done the analysis itself, you can describe how it will impact the hypothesis, and therefore how it will impact the overall problem you're working on. And of course, your analyses actually appear doable in terms of the time required, the effort required, the availability of data, etc. The warning signs, red flags that you jump into research or data collection before you fully design your analysis. So in other words, you start doing research, you start analyzing, but actually you don't have a really clear idea about what you want to prove and what the end of that work should look like, the end product of that work should look like. Or you can't describe clearly what the analyses are supposed to prove, or the analyses are somehow disconnected from the question tree. Then you are straying from your own project, probably. Okay, so that was the design. Now, for the execution, phase 5, so collect the data and analyze. So execution is where you're going to spend the bulk of your time. Most of your time is going to be in the execution. But actually, most of the thinking was done before. Yeah, so phases 1, 2, 3, 4, that's like 80% of the thinking. So the execution is really kind of it's probably the lowest intensity thinking in terms of all the phases. Phase 5 is probably the lowest intensity thinking. You just need to execute the plan that you made for yourself, collect the data, and run through the analysis. It's really just the building now. It's the actual building of the house. You just follow the plan. You follow the manual that you built for yourself. So I'm just going to share a few tips and techniques, mostly related to data collection. As much as possible, plan in advance, especially when you need data that, or let's say you're going to rely on others to provide you data. Plan ahead, because you don't completely control that process, right? When you make data requests, be smart. So keep in mind that you're always asking someone to take time out of their schedule to do work for you. And keep in mind that people can be very protective about data as well, for a number of reasons. Basically, there's some best practices. The best way to structure a data request is to first provide some context, the purpose of your project, what you're trying to achieve with your project. Then describe the very specific hypothesis that you're trying to validate or prove or test, and how that fits into, how that connects with the project. And describe the analysis that you want to do to test this hypothesis. So basically, you're really providing the background here. And then be very specific with your request. So describe the type of data that you want, for example, number of laptops sold. Describe the level of detail so by year and by country. So these are the columns, let's say, and then describe the scope. So for example, all Asian countries in the last 3 years. And right away, ask for alternative suggestions in case the data that you want doesn't exist in the format that you're asking for it. So in other words, make the other person a part of the solution, turn them into a partner in helping you get this rather than simply somebody who just needs to get the data for you, right? So that's something that can really help. Keep in mind, guesstimates are fine. It's totally fine. In fact, perfect data doesn't exist, so there's a very good chance you're going to need to make guesstimates and assumptions. You just need to be explicit when you do that. And a good idea is to also kind of conduct sensitivity analyses. So in other words, test how sensitive are your results to changes in those assumptions, into those inputs. If your ultimate results are not super sensitive, great. And if it is, that's fine. But then you just need to flag this. And then maybe what it means is that kind of like, hey, I don't know, we should only move ahead if we believe that, this input is at least this much. Because if the input is actually below this level, then, it becomes too risky to go ahead with whatever this idea. Apply the 80-20 rule. So again, just, again, you don't need complete data. So if you're missing a couple of pieces of data, ask yourself, do I really need them? Or do I have enough to make a credible analysis, right? And then if you're ever stuck with, because this happens a lot, people often get stuck because they can't find the data that they're looking for. I've seen this technique applied a few times. I think it's very nice. It's the 5-10 technique. So you set a timer for five minutes, and basically you give yourself those 5 minutes to come up with at least 10 different ways of getting that data somehow. It doesn't matter how good or bad your ideas are. The idea is that you just push yourself to come up with ideas. And at the end of the 5 minutes, at that point, you look at the list, and then probably there's a couple of things in there that are not so bad, a couple of ideas in there that are not so bad. And if you think through them some more, you might actually be able to convert them into real things that you can do. So there we go. That's kind of like the tips and techniques on collecting data. You're going to conduct your analyses, and then of course, once you're done with your analyses, ask yourself, so what? What about that? So first do a reality check. Do the results even make sense? Sometimes, you might expect a result between 15 and 20 and you get like 200. And so, okay, so, that there was probably a mistake made somewhere, right? If it doesn't make sense, so there was probably an error. If it does make sense, then ask yourself, is it conclusive or not? Can you actually draw a conclusion from whatever you found? If not, maybe you need to redo the analysis with a different data source or redesign the analysis. Or maybe you just accept that we can't draw a conclusion. That might also be okay. If it's conclusive, then ask yourself, is the hypothesis validated? Is it not validated? And, what are the implications for the bigger problem at hand? Sometimes the result of an analysis, like the kind of insight that comes from an analysis, raises new questions that we had not anticipated before, and then now require their own analyses. So you kind of want to go through this process for each analysis that you've conducted, to basically kind of make sense of your analysis results. Yeah. And of course, discuss all these results with your sponsor. What we'll do in the next phase, the next phase, or the next webinar, we'll talk about the whole process of translating analysis results into actual recommendations. Here, right now, you just need to make sense of the results, but then we'll talk about how to take that all the way to translating that into recommendations. But okay, but so for phase 5, basically, I think it can be, I mean, you'll know when you're done with your analyses, right? But basically, you've done all the analyses you planned, they're robust, they've produced clear results, and you put the results on slides and discuss them with your sponsor, and your sponsor has validated the analyses, even if they don't like the results, but at least they're kind of like, yeah, I see, I get it, I believe what you're showing me. That's kind of the ideal in terms of bringing your sponsor, taking them with you on your journey and taking them through the sort of the discovery process with you. Warning signs, red flags. So this is a big no-no. Sometimes people skip an analysis because they can't collect the data. That is a logical fallacy to do this. If you deemed that the analysis was important, then simply the fact that there's not the data around doesn't mean that the analysis isn't important. But when we skip the analysis, we're basically saying the analysis isn't important. So there's a logical fallacy here. If you can't do the analysis, or you can't collect the data, then you want to ask yourself, what could be another way of trying to demonstrate the same thing? Can I think of another analysis? Yeah. Okay, so discarding data or analysis because they disprove the hypothesis, that's obviously not the right thing to do. Then doing research unrelated to the hypothesis you want to test, because that presumably is a waste of time. Or yeah, you've just kind of lost sight of what you're trying to do and why you're doing it, in which case you probably want to take a step back and again, start at the beginning, which is what's the problem I'm trying to solve, and so on and so forth. Good. So next steps. So yes, oops, hold on. The new proposal deadline, I think, is 31st of August, if I'm not mistaken. So if you haven't yet, I would say keep working on your project definition and your roadmap, your question tree. If you're ready, start executing your project. So drawing your hypotheses and starting to build your analysis plans and executing your analyses. There will be one office hour. I will have one. Of course, I'm sure Franziska will have her own as well. But I will have one on the 27th of August for an hour and a half. So that's actually 4 days before the proposals are due. So I can imagine that some of you might want to come for that. But if you're already, if you've already started to work on the project and you want to talk about something related to one of your analyses, we can, of course, do that as well. It's completely up to you. And then there's going to be about a 6-week hiatus. And we're going to meet again in October, early October, for phase 6. So that's going to be the bit where I show you how to translate analysis results into recommendations. And voila, that is what I had for you today. Any questions about?
No, so far that was really helpful. Thank you. I have to think about this and work on. I think next time I will use a chance to get in more detail on my case.
Great.
This was what I was looking for. I have no specific question. Eric, the floor is yours.
Hi, Nicholas. Just to let you know that I'm usually stuck with the kid at 6 o'clock, so that's why I usually just catch up with the recordings. But I'm following what you're presenting to us, even if it's not live.
No worries. I'm not. I completely understand. I think as an EMBA, you have made the decision to have a very difficult life, which I totally respect. No, I totally get it. Yeah. But is there a question I can help you with?
Well, maybe only in an indirect way. I think my project is around making let's say not a full go-to-market strategy, because I remember you told me also in one of the recordings that that was a quite comprehensive thing, but that I'm expected to work out a strategy to enter the German market with battery storage services.
Okay.
So it's engineering consultancy basically, right? Like, so the same way you would do it for wind or solar, we're doing it for large scale battery storage devices. And here comes the question. My impression is that my boss is quite confident with the results I've presented so far in terms of, a first plan and screenings of customer base, competition, Germany, landscape, etc. And he kind of wants to already move into contacting clients, getting business running, etc. So this is kind of getting ahead of what would have been a theoretical delivery schedule for this work. So
Yeah.
now I'm kind of trying to figure out what that would mean for the final project. If it would mean just that I would extend it towards mapping how potential initial engagements are going and include that into the work. Yeah, that kind of.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, no, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So my thoughts would be the following. So I think the first thing is that in general, kind of as a matter of, let's say, principle, you don't want to let your final report project get in the way of your business, right? So if your boss's timeline is the right timeline for the business, then your boss should go ahead with that timeline, and then you should not stop him because your timeline is different.
Yeah.
So now it could be, maybe, I don't know, that's certainly something you should ask yourself. Is my boss being a little bit too, like, moving a little bit too fast? Not because of your timeline, but simply because maybe there isn't enough evidence yet, that there isn't enough plans, are not concrete enough, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think that maybe he's moving a little bit too fast, then that might be a conversation that you want to have with your boss. Okay, that's just you being a good advisor, a good help to your boss. But let's suppose that actually your boss's timeline is completely defensible, so it's a reasonable timeline, and of course it doesn't fit yours. The way that I would think about it is that I think you should probably not. The risk with it, I think you have two options. You can either adapt your project to his timeline. The risk with that is that, like, first of all, you have no control because he might change again the timeline and stuff like this, right? So then you potentially put yourself at the mercy of basically a process that you have very little control over. But then the second thing is that, like, the speed might be such that, like, there is very little time for you to do proper analysis work. And then you end up with some kind of a report that, from an analytical perspective, has no depth. So I would steer away from the option of adapting the report to the actual business timeline. But what you can do, I think the other option is to stick to your own timeline, even though the business goes ahead with its timeline, so that you do all the analyses and so on and so forth. And it probably will be a little bit less useful to your boss, because in a sense, a lot of the stuff that you will do will come in kind of after he's made some decisions. So there might be a little bit of this disconnect. But the thing is, you are going to be, I mean, the benefit is that I think there's a couple of benefits. One is, to the extent that you bring in new insights that are maybe new insights, that will be helpful to the business, either by confirming kind of like the path that, like, your boss took, or actually being like, hey, hold on. You've kind of started going in this direction, but actually the evidence suggests that maybe, so that will still be helpful. And then it'll be helpful to you in the sense that, like, by not going too fast, you will have a report that has like analytical depth, which is kind of what these final reports are supposed to be. So that's generally a little bit how I would think about it.
Thanks, that helps. I think I will probably end up doing a mix, because I do believe that the fact that he wants us starting to talk to clients doesn't mean that a market analysis as such is done, because we don't have even a first project. So I believe that even if we do get the opportunity to do a first project, that could be part of the analysis itself, right? A learning process out of that project.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So that would be the way I would spin it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think indeed, it's the, let's say the good approach is probably somewhere, like you said, it's a mix, somewhere in between the two, right? I think it's just in general, like, don't sacrifice the analytical depth, and don't put yourself too much at the mercy of something. Don't put yourself in a situation where you depend on that process for your project in such a way that because too much, because the process of the business process might actually change again, and you might be in a tough spot. So these are the things to watch out for.
Yes. No, that helps. Thank you.
Good. Great. Then let me just kind of finish with the last bit to wish everybody a good summer. And then we'll reconnect during office hours at the end of August, and then in early October.
Perfect.
All right.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, Nicola.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.